Hi there, welcome to the video lecture on Chapter 5, which focuses in on the First Amendment. So the First Amendment prohibits Congress from making any laws that restrict the freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, or right to gather or assemble peacefully and to request the government to respond to complaints from its citizens. So that's quite a lot there. We'll talk briefly about each one of these in turn. First up, freedom of religion. This is the first right expressed in the Bill of Rights. We know from documents that the Founding Fathers wanted to guarantee every individual religious freedom. It forbids the government to constrain or limit people's choice of beliefs, and this has been important in the legal system, and that church and state need to be kept separate. However, this is really challenging to do in practice. The Establishment Clause says that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. This is interpreted to mean that Congress cannot create a national church or say that everyone in America is going to be a Catholic or Jewish or whatever the faith may be. Congress cannot do that. If someone wants to challenge the Establishment Clause, they need to show that there is a secular purpose, that the principal impact of the program, the law, whatever it may be, neither advances nor inhibits religion, and that there's not an excessive entanglement between government and religion. So examples of times that this has been challenged and been found a bit okay are like charter schools or religious-based schools, Catholic schools. Those types of things have been challenged, and they are okay for them to, for instance, receive some federal funding. The Free Exercise Clause says we cannot limit how you exercise your religious faith. This is the freedom to believe and the freedom to act. Now, freedom of speech is the idea that we can all speak openly without fear of the government coming to restrain us. This is closely linked to the freedom of the press, and because the press is speaking and hearing people. Now, there are different types of speech that's really important to discuss. The first is pure speech. This is verbal or written speech that gives your message. This is protected by the First Amendment, but can be limited, like libel and slander laws. So examples, this lecture, if you guys email me with a question about this lecture, all that is speech. Symbolic speech, by contrast, is the expression of an idea or an emotion without words. This is protected speech. First Amendment includes pure speech, it includes symbolic speech. Past examples of cases that have made their way to the Supreme Court and that behaviors have been considered speech are wearing a black armband to protest the Vietnam War around your wrist, around your arm, while you're a student and that violated the school's dress code. Flag burning, cross burning, nude dancing, and yard signs are all examples of symbolic speech. Now, so we have these rights, this freedom of speech, but no constitutional right is absolute. We've spent most of the semester at this point working our way through, especially these ones that have the strong ties to criminal justice. Now we're getting to the ones that have relationship to criminal justice, but are not as prominent as the 4th, 5th, 6th, 8th Amendment. But none of those rights we've talked about today have had this, you don't have this absolute freedom to be searched, for instance. So the government can place reasonable limits, especially during times of war, where what's reasonable becomes an even bigger category than a non-war time. Espionage is technically would be a restriction of your freedom of expression, your freedom of speech, but it is okay for the government to limit that. Another example of freedom of speech in RAV v. St. Paul in 1992, a teenager was arrested for burning a cross in the yard of a Black family. And he was able to challenge his conviction under the city ordinance that prohibited cross burning and hate speech. That because the government was telling him that he couldn't say certain things, that he couldn't engage in discriminatory speech against people in the color of their skin, and cross burning is a form of speech. So the ordinance was vague. It did not, and it violated your ability to speak. When you get really into First Amendment issues and First Amendment cases, it's really important that the government not tell you what you can and cannot say here, even if you're expressing something that is unpopular, potentially immoral. None of those things mean the government should tell you cannot engage in that type of speech. Okay. Miller v. California dealt with the regulation of obscene material, and statutes cannot regulate. The obscene material can be regulated, but there are limits. So if an average person applying a contemporary community standard finds the dominant theme of the material, taken as a whole, appeals to the prurient interests, that is having a tendency to excite lustful thoughts, then it is obscene and it can be regulated. All right. Continuing on, when we are dealing with speech that might endanger individuals, there's a clear and probable danger test, which is whether the gravity of the evil is discounted by the improbability justified an invasion of the free speech to avoid danger. That's really unclear. And so in 1969, we had the Supreme Court adopting the imminent lawless action test. Speech is not protected under the First Amendment if the speaker subjectively intended incitement, the words used were likely to produce imminent lawless action, and the words used objectively encouraged and urged incitement. So if we think about that, maybe if you go to a concert and the band sees all this energy and all these people are invested, and he urges everyone to riot and burn down the restaurant across the street. That might suffice here, as long as the person in the band intended to produce that incitement, and he intended that the people listening would hear him and act upon this urge to burn down, commit arson to the restaurant across the street. And objectively, looking at it from someone who wasn't there, do we also agree that those words encourage and urge incitement? If so, that is not protected speech. Now, when we are dealing with restrictions on speech, strict scrutiny applies here. So we talked about strict scrutiny last week with the 14th Amendment. That applies here. Government must have a compelling interest, and the law must be narrowly tailored to fit that interest. This is a really high standard, and it's difficult because it should be difficult for the government to regulate our speech. Now, continuing on, constitutional rights can be applied differently depending on your job. So as public employees, for instance, law enforcement officers' speech is protected under the First Amendment only if it is a matter of public concern and it's unrelated to employment. And your book does work through some examples of this in more detail. And the First Amendment does provide citizens the right to record an officer performing official duties in a public place. Now, your book just kind of throws this out there and is pretty vague. I definitely would urge you to engage with this using caution and to look up your local standards, because in some places only one person needs to consent to record. In other states, it's the state law that both parties need to consent for recording to occur. So there are, it's not as clear cut as this slide in this section of your book make it seem. Now, freedom of the press, this is related to speech. The right to publish is not absolute. The federal government and state governments can restrict the right to publish by in two ways. They can work to prevent publishing of certain materials, for instance, classified information, and someone who punishes sedition, obscene materials, or libel can later be punished for that. So, like, sedition is a crime, so you could be incarcerated for engaging in sedition. Now, another First Amendment right is peaceful assembly. This is dealing with the right to gather and interact and speak your ideas. Again, the government cannot just say people can't gather. That would be unconstitutional. Now, related to the ability to peacefully assemble is the freedom of association. This is not specifically enumerated in the First Amendment, but this is the idea that we have the ability to choose who we associate with, who we sit next to, who we go to church with. If we don't like people, we can disassociate and go to a different church or a different bowling alley or a different restaurant. Like, we have this ability to do these things. So, First Amendment rights. There is a section in this book that does deal specifically with the First Amendment rights of prisoners because their rights are different. So through litigation, prisoners have secured some additional rights under the First Amendment. Now, when we're dealing with freedom of speech and religion, we saw strict scrutiny applies. However, when we're dealing with someone who's incarcerated, courts do not use that strict scrutiny standard. They use the lowest threshold of rational basis. So as long as it's really reasonably related to a legitimate penological interest, then the restriction stands. We have seen that people can that the cases deal with censorship of mail, association, and expression within the institution, religion, appearance, and visitation. Now, these things are still ongoing. There's a lot of cases out there. For instance, I will pull up and show you a recent one. So, in the Oye, the case Holt v. Hobbs. Holt is in a supermax prison facility. This case came before most of the current Supreme Court, but it was from 2015. And in this case, Holt sued the Arkansas Department of Corrections. He is a practicing Salaf Muslim, and he sought to be allowed a change to the grooming policy. So he wanted to be able to grow a short beard to be within as a necessary part of the practice of his religion, and that this policy prohibited him from practicing his religious faith because it completely prohibited facial hair. And Holt was willing to limit the length of his beard to half an inch, but he argued that it was necessary he be able to grow this beard because of his faith. So the legal question is, does Arkansas Department of Corrections grooming policy violate this act? But in relation, we see this is really tied to the First Amendment. And we see the Supreme Court ruling 9-0 that yes, this policy does violate this policy in part because we're looking at the First Amendment, even under a rational basis review, there is not a reason why he should not be able to have a short beard within this policy. This does deal a little bit with the specific religious land use and institutionalized persons act, but it is also dealing with religious exercise. So this is a really interesting case. There's a lot actually, there have been a lot of articles published about it, and Holt, some of the pleadings, if you go to the Supreme Court website, are fully available, and he represented himself for at least part of this. So it's pretty interesting. I would encourage you to look into it more. All right, I look forward to working with you. Let me know what questions